Holly and Jason Jenkins had lived in the luxurious Spanish Wells community in Florida for the past 3 decades. They'd moved there when their 2 sons were just teenagers. Back then, they were one of the few people who weren't retired to call the place home. But Holly knew the moment that she set foot in Spanish Wells that this was the place where she would live and retire. There was no reason to wait until their old days before they bought a home there. Now, 35 years later, on July 8, 2013, with both their children grown up and starting families of their own, Jason and Holly, 69 and 71, spent their time roaming the grounds, with Jason playing golf and managing his investments, and Holly using her time to become a published author, as well as being a part of every club and activity that the area had to offer. Holly was well-traveled, and her house was filled with souvenirs from her visits to other countries. But her most prized possession of all was her dog, Gibson. He was a geriatric mutt that she'd found behind a dumpster many years ago as a puppy. Gibson was as spoiled and adored as any puppy could possibly hope for. Even as old as he was, Gibson was still insistent on his long morning and evening walks. That day was no different. Holly and Jason woke up at 6 a.m., and when everyone had had their breakfast, Gibson became antsy and impatient. It was now past 7, and he hadn't been out for his morning rounds yet, so he reminded Holly about her tardiness by grabbing his own leash and bringing it to her. Holly, laughing at Gibson's antics, put on her walking shoes and left Jason in his office, who was checking up on his various investments and stock trades. She and Gibson walked the sidewalks between the houses for the first half an hour, with Gibson on the leash. But after that, they turned off to the lagoon, where Gibson could be taken off his leash to stretch his stiff legs a little more freely. And sure enough, the moment Holly unclipped his restraints, the canine sped off into the grass, sending a flock of birds up in the air. The 2 of them could only walk as far as the golf course, where no dogs were allowed on the immaculate lawns, before turning back the same way they'd come. Usually, Gibson spent around 2 hours rooting out rodents from holes and scaring birds into the air before he got tired, and Holly inevitably had to carry him home for the final 15 minutes of his walk. Old Gibby lifted his leg on a patch of reeds growing right along the shores of the water and jogged over to a stump that hadn't yet gotten a spritz of his scent yet. But when the dog lifted his leg to mark what looked like a washed-up log, the stump moved. Gibson yelped in shock when the 10-foot alligator snapped angrily at him. Holly, not even thinking about how dangerous the situation was for her, rushed forward, shouting and waving her arms, trying to scare the beast away from her dog. Gibson ran to his master, tail between his legs, howling in fear. Holly was only a few feet away from the monster when it turned toward her and the explosion of noise that she was making. Staring the woman straight in the eye, it leapt toward her. The alligator, as large as it was, moved with such speed that it became a serpentine blur in the grass. Holly stumbled back, about to turn around and run. For a fleeting second, she thought about yelling for help, but her legs knotted around each other in her hasty attempt to turn around. She went down hard. With her back to the floor, she was unable to break her fall with her hands. But she didn't just hit hard earth. Her head connected with a rock the size of a football. She heard the crack reverberating inside her skull. Holly was so disoriented that she didn't even realize that the beast had grabbed her by the right foot. She didn't feel the teeth sink into her calf, or feel her back scraping the ground as the alligator started to pull her towards the water. Holly had also fractured her skull and dislocated the vertebrae beneath it, rendering her instantly paralyzed. Already, the blood pooling at the base of her brain was causing so much pressure that her mind was starting to shut down. Her vision swam before her, and her extremities tingled as the nerves were desperately trying to send signals to get up and run to her brain. Confused and completely out of it, Holly tried to raise her hands to her head, but they wouldn't move. Then she realized that the clouds above her were not moving with the breeze. It was her that was moving, and the pressure on her calf told her that she was being dragged. In a moment of horror, the truth finally hit Holly. She was being hauled to her death and unable to move a muscle. There was nothing she could do to stop the animal from taking her into the lagoon. Cold water of the lagoon hit her feet, and Gibson yapped in her ears. It reached her knees, and she felt the cold and the pain. Now her hips were submerged, and her ankle was being pulled slowly out of its socket. Then the water hit her chest, and her head went under. Finally, Holly felt the incomprehensibly strong, muscular tail twine itself around her waist, dragging her into the darkness, where she drowned silently and immobile. She was completely aware of what was happening to her each and every second of the way, but unable to move. It was Gibson's panicked barking at the edge of the lagoon that finally drove an annoyed neighbor, Harold Miller, out of his residence 20 minutes later. He knew Gibson and the Jenkins, and he was surprised to see that neither Holly nor Jason were with their beloved mutt. Frowning, Mr. Miller went closer. Something was obviously very wrong here. He looked in the direction that the dog was whining and howling, and on the other side of the lagoon, basking in the sun, lay an enormous alligator. Miller had seen plenty of the creatures around before, but that wasn't what drove the cold fear into his heart. It was the lifeless body lying in front of the animal's snout that had him running to his house in panic. It was there where he called the authorities. When wildlife and rescue arrived, the gator was aggressively guarding Holly's remains. They dispatched the creature and hauled both it and Holly away in separate vehicles. It was only when the sirens of the ambulance that was carrying Holly went by their house that Jason realized that his wife hadn't been home for more than 4 hours. He became so engrossed in his work that he'd completely lost track of time, and the sirens were what finally brought him back to reality. Jason wasn't worried at all. He just assumed that Holly had stopped by a friend's house for a visit when she'd taken Gibson out for his walk. But he did go out to see what the commotion with the sirens was about. When Jason opened the door to step out, he walked right into the policeman who was about to knock at the door. The officer was carrying a wet and violently shaking Gibson in his arms. Jason knew immediately that the sirens had been for his wife, even before the officer told him. Almost 2 weeks went by before the Jenkins family could lay Holly to rest. The injury on her head was unusual for a gator attack, and police were worried that she'd been killed by another human being before being dumped in the lagoon where the alligator found her. But they did eventually find the blood-stained rock, still with Holly's hair and tissue embedded in it, next to the water. And from there, even days later, the drag marks were still visible, where the animal had pulled her into the depths. Holly's husband, sons, and grandchildren mourned and eventually recovered from their loss, but Gibson never did. The poor pup declined steadily for the next 3 months, inconsolable in his grief and the arthritis that was finally getting the better of him. In 3 short months, Gibson went from chasing birds to never leaving his bed, until he just didn't wake up one morning. Gibson undoubtedly joined Holly in a place where she could travel and he could chase birds for the rest of eternity. They are together again after Holly's terrifying final affliction. The Miccosukee Indian Reservation Resort and Convention Center in Dade County is almost always packed. The high tourist season brings plenty of visitors who come for the airboat tours of the Everglades and the swanky facilities that have great food, spas, and all sorts of entertainments. And in the off-season, the place is booked to the brim with conventions and end-of-year functions. November 2007 was at the time of year when Miami is at its quietest. The summer winds down, and there's just enough heat left to still get a good look at some of the fantastic wildlife in the swamps. This is a time when the tourists are gone, and the Miami natives make use of their beautiful surroundings just before the dry season kicks into full gear. Miccosukee had 2 functions going on that day. One was an engineering convention, and the other was a farewell for some big-shot Wall Street-type executives. The day was looking like it was going to be a busy one, but not more than usual. The crowd was made up of academics and older business types, all wearing lanyards to get them access to their various seating arrangements and sleeping quarters. This rather boring crowd was exactly what they needed after the chaotic back-to-back events that they had hosted in the past 3 months. The lack of activity might have been a relief for Miccosukee, but not so much for the underbelly of Miami. The 2 car thieves prowling the parking lot were getting desperate. High season brought plenty of pockets to pick on overcrowded streets, and more than enough cars were accidentally left unlocked by distracted tourists. So Heriberto Rubio and Justo Padron turned to the resorts and hiking trails to fund their criminal careers. Today, they weren't after pocket change. They were looking for cars that still had their keys in the ignition or hidden under seats. If they could get a car out of the lot, they'd have it stripped and the parts sold off before the end of the day. Both men were well into their 30s, and this was how they'd gotten by since their teens. Neither Heriberto nor Justo wanted anything to do with the violent crime sector. At least, this version of criminality was violence-free and low risk, and the people they targeted were almost certain to have car insurance anyway, so they didn't feel too guilty about the thievery that was about to take place. The 2 slinked behind bushes all morning, only coming out when the parking lot emptied completely. They found 2 unlocked cars and stole a few electronics and some money in the glove compartments, but neither of the vehicles had any keys in them. But they weren't deterred. Someone was bound to come along and leave a set behind, so they waited patiently for the right opportunity to arrive. Unbeknownst to them, they'd left the door to one of the cars that they'd targeted slightly ajar, an expensive sedan that held a laptop and some banknotes that they hid in the bushes where they were hidden. The owner of the vehicle broke away from the engineering convention to retrieve his computer, only to discover the open door and the missing laptop. He alerted the resort manager of the theft, and the staff immediately contacted authorities. While the furious engineer waited in the reception area for police, Heriberto and Justo were already back in the lot. Unaware of the police, Heriberto continued searching unlocked cars and finally found a car with its keys still in the ignition. He called Justo just as he was getting in on the driver's side, and the 2 police cars pulled in behind them. Justo saw them first, and after yelling a quick warning to his companion, he sprinted into the brush. But Heriberto was stuck. One of the patrol cars was parked right behind him, and 2 officers descended on the man who had already started the car. In a desperate final attempt to get away, Heriberto reversed, hoping to get out, but he hit the police car behind him, and before he could even think of going forward, he was pulled out of his seat and wrestled to the ground. Meanwhile, the other patrol car saw Justo streaking off into the wilderness, and the 2 officers jumped out in pursuit. The ground was uneven, and the overgrowth left them plenty of traps to trip over. Justo was as quick and limber as he had been when he was a teenager. He sidestepped and jumped over any obstacles with sure feet and at a breakneck speed. The officers were in great shape, but they were no match for the barefoot thief who moved as fast as lightning ahead of them. Justo cleared the patch of growth in seconds, leaving the policemen blundering around behind him. Ahead of him was a lake that was fed by a small river, and beyond that was the resort fence line. If he could get to the fence, Justo was as good as gone. There was no way they could catch up with him once he was out in the open swamp. Luckily, Justo was as good a swimmer as he was at running. Without breaking his speed, he dove into the murky water gracefully. The staff and resort goers had spilled out onto the lawn to catch a glimpse of the spectacle playing out on the grounds. One man was being handcuffed and stuffed into a dented patrol car, and the other was leading a spectacular chase that ended with a splash. The 2 officers in pursuit were already winded, and Justo was clearly going to win this race. But the staff of Miccosukee were horrified at the sight of the agile man streaking past them. They knew better than anyone how dangerous that water was. The resort was home to a very large alligator, which the employees playfully named Pancho. Pancho basked in the sun on the banks almost every morning, and he never paid any mind to the people. The lake was covered in signs warning everyone not to swim there due to the alligator presence. But obviously, Justo hadn't noticed any of these signs with all of his attention on his flight from the cops. The waitresses and groundskeepers yelled at him in a mix of Spanish and English, screaming that there was a gator on the other side of the lake. Pancho woke up from his slumber in the sun, All of the commotion was not at all what he had in mind this afternoon. The predator scanned the crowd and then the lake. To its surprise, there was a human swimming past him. This was unprecedented. Never before had humans ever come even close to its domain, and certainly not alone in the water. Pancho didn't need telling twice. The person swimming past him was a meal, practically gift-wrapped for him to take. Pancho slipped into the cool, dark lake, propelling itself with its tail so fast that not even Justo could outswim it, no matter how good of a swimmer he was. The crowd was hysterical, and some of the braver men even went to the very edge of the pond to get Justo's attention. The two police officers came to a halt where Justo had dived in. Even they started yelling for the man to get out, but Justo was deaf to their screams. The only sound in his ears was the rushing water and his heartbeat beating in his skull. And every time his head came up for air, he only had eyes for the fence line that promised freedom. He was halfway across the lake now, pumping his arms like he'd never done before. Justo was oblivious to the danger closing in on him, and the crowd stood horrified, watching the reptilian hunter sink into the water, swim toward the man, and finally, they saw the beast reach the thief and pull him smoothly and soundlessly under the water. Taken completely by surprise, Justo felt the heavy, scaled body close over his back, twisting around him as it wound Justo into its coils. The horrifying realization of what was happening hit Justo just as the gator started spinning him in its drowning death roll. But it was too late now. He was securely trapped, and his head was turned upside down while water flooded into his mouth. Justo grabbed desperately at the hard scales, trying with all of his might to pull and push the animal off him. But his efforts were useless. It was like clawing at rocks, and Pancho didn't slow down its spinning or react in any way to the man's struggles. Round and round he was thrown, screaming soundless bubbles as the animal pulled him deeper and deeper into the dark. The gator didn't waste time spinning his prey on the surface of the water like they normally do. With all the screaming and yelling from the shore, it dove deep under the water to finish the kill without any humans interfering from the surface. As it turned in circles, it squeezed its body tighter around the man. Justo felt his ribs shatter into his already waterlogged lungs. The lake water he'd inhaled was now joined with blood. The immense pressure and the unbearable pain started to fade away as he lost consciousness. He was already passed out when the creature latched onto him, landed at the bottom of the lake. It kept lying there, 50 feet below the surface, until it felt Justo's heartbeat stop. Only when it was absolutely sure that the man was dead did it release its hold. The alligator quickly repositioned its grip on Justo and swam him to a more secure location where it could feed in peace. On the lake's banks, more help had already been called, and Heriberto was driven away in handcuffs. From the back of the patrol car, he'd heard the commotion, and he was able to put together the pieces about what was happening. He was horrified and helpless to do anything about Justo's predicament, and Heriberto knew he was never going to see the man he'd known since they were teenagers. Diving teams and more police cars arrived as Heriberto was driven out of the parking lot to the nearest jail. The ride was almost completely silent, broken only by the officers giving him their condolences. Even they found the entire affair hard to absorb. Later that night, the same two officers visited Heriberto in his cell to inform him that his friend's remains had been found, that the alligator responsible for his death had been killed, and that any remains still left in its stomach had been recovered and placed with its owner. Unfortunately, Heriberto wasn't able to attend the funeral alongside his friend's family. He had no one to bail him out while he awaited his court date. So Heriberto was forced to sit on his cot on the day he knew Justo was being put into the ground, left with only his thoughts and regrets. The Miccosukee Indian Reservation never allowed another predator to make its home on the property again. If an alligator was spotted for more than 2 days in a row, they'd chase it back into the swamp where it belonged. Pancho was the last gator they ever tolerated after that day, fearing someone else would meet the same terrifying final affliction. Fort Myers, Florida is the kind of place where a 20-year-old comes during spring break or on a wild party weekend with friends. But that wasn't why Michelle Reeves was in Florida for the weekend. She and her father, James, had come out to check on his parents, who were also Michelle's grandparents. The pair had been retired and living in Fort Myers for almost 10 years now, and they seemed determined to ignore the fact that they were getting on in years. Just the week before Michelle's grandfather got into his head that he was going to fix the gutter that had blown apart with the last storm of the summer. Predictably, Gramps had made it 5 steps up the ladder before he slipped and fell. Luckily, he hadn't made it very far up, or it would have been much worse. So now he sat with his broken ankle up in the air, making poor Gran just as miserable as he was. It wasn't James Sr. who had called for help. He'd never admit that he was at fault for his predicament. It was his wife, Diane Reeves, who called James Jr. to come over and give her a break from the grumpy 73-year-old and his blasted broken ankle. So James and Michelle flew in all the way from Roswell, Georgia, to cheer the old man up and to allow Diane some support. Michelle loved visiting Florida. Roswell was beyond boring, and the change in scenery was a much-needed one, and she genuinely loved her grandparents. Besides, her term at Georgia University had been a busy one, and she was in dire need of a break from studies, activism, and her true passion, poetry. She wasn't planning on touching a computer or a pen for the next week. She needed the break from hard work just as much as her grandmother from Grandpa James. They arrived on Friday the 24th and were planning on staying well into the next week. But Michelle drooped like a flower in the heat. Autumn was taking its time to arrive, and even though Roswell was a pretty warm place, it was nothing compared to Florida. After spending all day Friday unpacking and strolling around the neighborhood to greet the residents, Michelle expected the evening to bring a break from the heat. But no, it was just as hot and humid as it was during the day. Michelle spent that first evening tossing and turning, barely getting any sleep in at all. The next morning, before she and her father were going to start fixing the gutter, Michelle put on her bathing suit and headed out to the lake that the retirees' houses were built around. But Michelle's plans for a cool dip were cut short. Diane stopped her in her tracks just as she was about to walk out the door. There had been a few sightings in the past few weeks of a large 7-foot alligator in the lake, and she told Michelle to march her butt right back in and to get dressed. Until the thing was caught or when it decided to find another place to make its home, the entire community had been warned to stay away from the water. So Michelle spent the rest of the day in the scorching sun, holding the ladder while her father fixed the gutter, then a squeaky window, and finally they repotted some of her grandmother's shrubs into bigger planters. By late afternoon, Michelle and James Jr. were soaked with sweat, and their cheeks were red from the Florida heat. Before her grandparents could dole out another job, Michelle sneaked off and hopped into a cold shower, leaving her father to clear the rest of the garden while James Sr. sat in a lawn chair, giving out orders. If it weren't for the heat, Michelle would have loved helping out. Her grandparents might seem critical and stern to others, but really, all of the scolding and bossing around was done good-naturedly, and with more love and cookies than Michelle's stomach could hold. The shower helped enormously, but by the time the night came again with its damp heat, Michelle was sweating all over again. Like the night before, she tossed and turned uncomfortably. She got up several times in the night to get a drink of water to cool off, and that's where Diane found her granddaughter in front of the fridge at 1 a.m. Diane dished out some ice cream for the both of them, and they sat for an hour eating ice cream, talking about Michelle's next big projects at school. The ice cream sure helped when she was in the middle of eating it, but by 3 that morning, all of the frozen goodness was gone, and Michelle was right back where she started, tossing and turning another night away. Afraid that a cold shower this time of night would wake the whole house, the young woman slipped out the back door and headed out to the lake instead. Without her grandmother there to stop her, Michelle intended to take a quick dip. She'd be done before anyone was awake, and no one would even know she'd been gone all that time. The water should cool her off sufficiently enough to allow her to get at least a few hours of sleep. And since it was completely dark, there was no need to bother with a bathing suit. No one was going to see her outside at this time of night. With the crickets in her ears and the air outside as hot as it was inside the house, Michelle left her nightgown on the lake's shore and slipped quietly into the black water in an open space between some wild reeds. The opening held a few canoes that rocked lazily on the quiet water. The relief was instant. She didn't even bother to swim out. That would just create unnecessary noise. She wasn't wearing anything, after all, and didn't want her family to see her naked. She wasn't ready for that kind of embarrassing moment. Michelle sat down, submerging herself up to her shoulders in the shallows. About 6 feet away from the girl lay a very confused animal. The alligator had been floating near the edge of the lake, resting right between two canoes. It was half asleep, and it hadn't even heard Michelle walk up to the lake at all. It wasn't until her feet stepped into the water that it jerked awake. The lizard was caught completely off guard and lay deathly still for a good minute, taking in the situation. Its initial confusion faded away after it noticed that the woman was so conveniently close that this would be a wasted opportunity if it let her go. The gator had eaten 3 days before, so it wasn't particularly hungry. But when a meal walks right up and presents itself to you, it would be almost inconceivable not to try to take it down. The seconds passed by, and the alligator crept closer. Michelle took no notice of the alligator's stealthy approach. It was 7 feet long, just about the same size as the canoes it was swimming next to, making it easy to overlook. Michelle was wondering whether or not she should swim out after all, when she felt something hard and heavy nudge her arm. At first, she thought a log had drifted against her. It was definitely dark and bumpy enough to be a fallen tree, but then it moved with such speed and fluidity that she knew it was the alligator she'd been warned about. Before Michelle could even sort out whether or not to stay still or to run, its white teeth flashed in the moonlight. It clamped down on her right arm just above the elbow. Michelle let out one strangled cry, but before she could even get any volume behind her scream, she was twisted so violently that her shoulder dislocated, throwing her head first into the water ahead of her. The gator didn't need to get its prey into the deep water to drown her. It just needed to get her far enough to submerge her head. So, as it coiled around Michelle's body, it rolled from the shallow bank until it got about 5 feet from shore, deep enough for the gator and Michelle to be fully submerged. As the alligator spun her in circles, Michelle's face managed to break the surface for a split second, but instead of letting out a cry for help, water flooded her mouth as she tumbled around back into the deep. Michelle had no chance. Her arm was ripped out of its joint at the elbow before she succumbed to drowning. With the amount of blood loss from her missing arm and her inability to breathe, it took less than 2 minutes for the young poet to die. As quietly as she'd snuck out of the house and into the lake, she'd been pulled into the depths, and no one heard a thing. It wasn't until 10 a.m. that morning, with the sun already high in the sky, that James started looking for his daughter. He'd assumed that Michelle was sleeping in after the busy day they'd had yesterday. But when 10 o'clock came and went, he decided it was time to wake her up to get started on the broken air conditioning. But Michelle's bed was empty, and Diane mentioned that the back door was standing open that morning when she'd come into the kitchen to make breakfast. Not yet concerned, James walked around the property, thinking she'd gotten up earlier than them and gone for a walk. But his eyes fell on the yellow cotton nightgown lying in the grass next to the lake. And then James knew something was terribly wrong. He ran to the place where the canoes were tied, and before he even reached them, he saw his daughter lying face down among the reeds, her hair fanned out in the gentle current and her body starkly gray against the brown water. Screaming, James dragged Michelle out, but her eyes were blank and her lips were blue. The ragged stump that used to be her arm was no longer bleeding like it would if she were alive, and her upper body was covered in red and angry-looking bite marks. Before the day was over, Michelle's remains had been taken away, and her murderer had already been found, lying in the sun, basking in the pleasure of the late morning heat. The animal was sluggish with its overfull stomach, so it didn't take much to dispatch of it. Wildlife and rescue were able to remove Michelle's arm and return it in time for her funeral after her terrifying final affliction. On the evening of Tuesday, May 9, 2006, 28-year-old Yovi Suarez Jimenez was out for a jog. She was filled with an overwhelming feeling of depression and anxiety and hoped that being out in the fresh air would clear her mind. But she wasn't thinking straight. She had drunk a significant amount of alcohol to mask her feelings and had overdosed on Xanax, which she had been prescribed to cope with her anxiety. The toxic mixture that was swirling around her body clouded her mind and her judgment that day. She said goodbye to her family and left her mobile home, jogging along the streets for a few blocks. She then turned down along the canal. There was something calming about being near the water, but as dusk set in, danger lurked in the channel. Despite her mental struggles, Yovi was an intelligent young woman who was studying biology in Florida's Sunrise City. Situated in central western Broward County, Sunrise is a popular tourist destination with a cosmopolitan vibe and a vibrant economic climate. It attracts businesses from far and wide, but has the heart and soul of a small town. It is a short distance away from the beaches at Fort Lauderdale and often painted in colorful sunsets. Just like much of Florida, none of the waterways, lakes, and ponds is considered safe from alligators. They are thought to inhabit every body of fresh water in the state. There are estimated to be 1.4 million alligators in Florida, and as the human population continues to swell and developments eat into their natural habitat, their space is rapidly drying up. Sunrise is a commuter town that had been built on reclaimed land on the outskirts of the Everglades. This makes its residential neighborhoods particularly susceptible to the presence of alligators. But despite this, attacks on people are thankfully relatively rare. Yovi ran along the side of a canal. The water glistened in the moonlight, its silvery reflection shimmering off the surface. She stopped to catch her breath. Her mind was racing. She walked to a small bridge that crossed the canal and stepped down the bank, sitting underneath the bridge. She pulled out her mobile phone and called her mother. She needed to hear her voice. Everything felt at a loss for her. When her mother picked up the phone, she could tell that her daughter wasn't quite herself. Yovi told her that she was depressed. Things were troubling her, and she was struggling to cope. As the mixture of and alcohol swam around her body, the pain she was feeling was dulled down slightly. She looked out over the water. It was still and calm. A gentle breeze played with her hair as she spoke with her mom. She dipped her feet into the water. The coolness engulfed them, and she took in a deep breath. When she said goodbye to her mom, neither of them knew it would be the last time. Her vision became blurred, and she smiled to herself as the medication took hold. She lay back on the bank, staring up at the bridge above her. She just needed a moment. The alcohol warmed her, wrapping an invisible blanket of safety around her. But Yovi was not safe. She was far from it. Just yards away, hidden by the darkness of the night, an alligator was watching her. The opportunistic hunter remained perfectly still. Only its eyes and nostrils protruded through the surface of the canal. Usually on the hunt for fish, the alligator saw an opportunity, one that it intended on seizing. As Yovi closed her eyes, the alligator moved in. It was silent. Not a splash or a ripple alerted Yovi to the imminent danger. Stealthily, it swam directly towards the young woman. Her feet were still dangled in the water as the knobbly outline of the alligator's head and part of its tail glided across the water. At the last second, the alligator launched its attack. It leapt out of the water and onto land. It scuttled along the bank a short distance away and grabbed Yovi by the legs, attacking her rapidly on the grassy bank. She was suddenly awoken from her alcohol and Xanax-fueled stupor and thrashed around to try and break free from the animal's vice-like grip. But the attack was so ferocious and rapid that it is believed that Yovi was dead within a matter of seconds. The animal was thought to be around 10 feet long. Its jaws were powerful and its teeth sharp. When it secured its grip around its prey, there was no letting go. It bit into Yovi's leg, causing devastating damage. As Yovi began to lose consciousness from loss of blood, she was dragged into the water. The alligator then readjusted its grip and bit down on her back, ripping into her as she lay motionless in the water. As the attack was unfolding, relatives at her home grew increasingly concerned for her whereabouts. She wasn't usually out this long, and her final call to her mother had raised concerns. It wasn't until the following morning that Yovi's body was found floating in the canal by some construction workers. It was a gruesome discovery. Both of her arms had been amputated, and her leg had a severe wound on it. It was a tragic end to somebody so young, and immediately a search was initiated to find the killer reptile. Despite the huge numbers of alligators living in Florida, there have only been 18 human fatalities since records began in 1948. Even more rare are attacks in the suburbs. Yovi was incredibly unlucky, and although the drink and had likely clouded her judgment, she had been foolish to get so close to the water that night. The coroner couldn't tell whether Yovi had been conscious at the time of the attack or not, but she had definitely been alive. The wounds on Yovi's body revealed that the attack had been rapid, and she had likely died before she was dragged into the water. The alligator had then continued to devour her into the night. Authorities were so shocked by the incident that they declared an immediate cull. Any alligator found along that stretch of water was euthanized. The first alligator was captured on the Thursday night, 2 days after Yovi lost her life. Although it was only 6 or 7 feet long and not likely to be the culprit, authorities still killed it. Inside its stomach was a tennis ball and an American football, but no human remains. As fresh meat and offal, such as pig's lungs, were tied to pieces of strong nylon rope and tossed into the water, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation vowed to stop at nothing until the alligator responsible was caught. It took experts until the Saturday before they captured a more likely candidate for the attack. The alligator measured 9 feet 6 inches long, the size that was reflected in Yovi's injuries. Furthermore, it was caught underneath the bridge where Yovi had been seen by an eyewitness dangling her feet in the water. When they cut open its belly, they found 2 human arms inside. They had been swallowed whole and were still undigested. It seemed that they had caught the culprit, and the cull was called off. But the Sunshine State was about to be thrown into turmoil. In the following 6 days, 2 more people were fatally attacked by alligators. It was an unprecedented run of bad luck, and licensed alligator trappers had their hands full, with their phones constantly ringing from people wishing to get alligators removed from near their properties. The trio of deaths had people scared and anxious. People even called in the experts for small 3-foot alligators, as fear gripped the state. There was no single explanation for why there was an increase in attacks. Prior to that week, there had only been 17 recorded fatalities by alligators in the previous 58 years. At that time of the year, alligators become particularly aggressive as it's mating season. As well as that, water levels are typically low, forcing alligators into urban areas in search for more water and food. Following the attacks, officials warned people to stay away from the water's edge. It is an offense to feed, touch, or harass alligators in the waterways. Residents in Sunrise were more cautious about going outside when news of the attack spread. Young children were kept indoors, and dog walkers were particularly wary of the waterways, fearing they too would unexpectedly meet their terrifying final affliction. On the west coast of Florida, just a stone's throw from the city of Tampa, lies the picturesque landscape of Apollo Beach. All along the coastline, rivers run in from the ocean, feeding the swamps, lakes, and lush vegetation of the Everglades. Apollo is situated on one of these inlets, and it's not the kind of place that we regular folk would find ourselves. It's one of the best places to live in all of Florida. Quite frankly, there are more resorts, high-class hotels, and parks than there are permanent residents. And the small handful of people who do call the place home stay in gated communities or have several acres of land. But you don't throw your whole retirement savings into such an upscale area just to have noisy neighbors to deal with, after all. Kevin Murray was not one of the homeowners or the resort visitors. He was one of the very few people who lived and worked in the area permanently. The 41-year-old was never a fan of big cities, and even large towns were too crowded for his taste. Kevin loved the outdoors and his own company. He preferred the simple things in life, and as much of the outdoors as he could fit into his daily life as possible. So he tended to the retired residents' huge properties as a landscaper, and every now and then he added handyman to his job title. Kevin rarely charged the older members of Apollo for fixing their fences and changing light bulbs. He genuinely liked helping out where he could, and it gave him just enough social interaction to keep him satisfied. Besides, he liked hearing the old-timers' war stories, and they usually offered him a cold beer or some freshly baked cookies. The residents liked Kevin too. To them, he was an incredibly handy and versatile fellow to have around, a very valuable asset when you are relatively far removed from repairmen and maintenance workers. Most of the homeowners had more than enough money to get the best professionals in to do even the smallest of repairs. But why would they bother? Kevin was just as capable as anyone, and he was a friendly and polite character who was always willing to lend an ear to the sometimes lonely retirees. It was the 17th of July, 2005, and Kevin had been out working since 7 that morning. One of the residents, Mr. Hudgens, who was in his 80s, contracted Kevin to overhaul his entire front garden, new flower beds, transplanting entire trees, and Kevin even built pretty little whitewashed fences around every new tree transplant to protect them from the critters. Then there was the lawn, and the hedges and bushes that needed trimming too. Kevin was just powering through it all. He'd been busy on the place for 3 days, and he still had at least 2 more days left on the huge property before he'd be done with it all. The old man was a sweetheart, and he sat with Kevin in his camper chair wherever he was working, keeping the conversation going all day, every day. Kevin enjoyed his company very much, and after the day was done, he made a habit of driving down to the canal. There, right next to Bernhard's estate, was a jetty, and he took a quick dip to cool off and wash away the sweat and grime of the day. Richard and Laura Bernhard knew Kevin well, and they'd become accustomed to seeing him there in the late afternoon. Laura already dished out a serving of their dinner for Kevin in a Tupperware container, and it sat waiting for him on the patio table. The Bernhards were waiting with a glass of lemonade when Kevin came driving up in his ancient old truck at around 7 that evening. Kevin got out of his truck with yesterday's empty and cleaned Tupperware already in his hand. He returned Laura's plasticware, took the new fully stocked container, and they exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes. After thanking them, Kevin walked out onto the jetty, took off his shirt and shoes, and placed them next to his food. Then he dove into the canal. The cool water was an absolute delight after the muggy day full of hard work. Kevin struck out in a perfect breaststroke. If he'd been more interested in sports as a youngster, he could probably have knocked away a few scholarships for his swimming. He was already naturally tall and well-muscled, and with all of the manual work he put in on a daily basis, Kevin looked like a man 10 years younger than he was. But as he swam, an alligator lay watching on the far side of the canal. The animal had already noticed Kevin 2 days ago when he first came around for a swim. Then it waited on the second day at dusk again, and sure enough, the man dived in at the same spot, swam for about 20 minutes, and then got out of the water. And today was no different. The thing even recognized the sound of the pickup truck when it pulled in. Its attention peaked, and it slithered its 12-foot frame into the water. Once the small talk was out of the way and Kevin walked out onto the wooden platform, the gator sank beneath the surface and swam to the middle of the canal, resting its belly on the sandy bottom. It felt the vibrations from the splash as Kevin dove in, and a few minutes later, Kevin swam by overhead, just like it expected Kevin to do. Using its tail and muscular legs, the gator pushed itself off the ground. Like a speeding bullet, it rocketed through the water. Streamlined to perfection, its lengthy body felt no resistance as it barreled toward its target. Kevin was now just a few feet above it, so the beast opened its mouth wide. The impact that it hit Kevin with was so great that they both catapulted 5 feet out of the water. From the shore, the Bernhards sat horrified as they watched the man and beast sail through the air almost gracefully in a shower of blood and water. Kevin's scream of shock and terror was suddenly cut short as they hit the surface with a crash. His mouth flooded immediately, and he snapped it shut to avoid sinking his lungs, too. The alligator had him by the arm, and it attempted to spin Kevin down to the bottom. But Kevin yanked and pulled so hard that he tore his right out of the animal's grasp. He didn't even feel the pain as part of his arm ripped off into the alligator's mouth. Adrenaline was fueling him now. Kevin kicked up out of the deep. His head came up for air as he started swimming, one-handed, back the way he'd come. But the predator wasn't going to call it a day just yet. Graceful and quicker than you could imagine, it turned and catapulted right back at the man who was leaving a trail of red, irony blood in his wake. This time, it snapped its teeth around Kevin's torso and allowed its own weight to drag him down below. They sank horribly slowly, deeper and deeper into the all-encompassing darkness of the water. Even with the slicing of teeth around his stomach, digging into his organs, Kevin put in every ounce of strength he could muster. He grabbed at the thing's snout and tried to pull it apart. He jammed his fingers blindly for the eyes, hoping to find a weak point, but all his hands found were rock-hard scales. Kevin's lungs were starting to burn from lack of air, and his struggles became more panicked. He grappled wildly, even though the intense thrashing from him caused the animal's teeth to tear and rip at him. It felt like he was fighting an immovable rock. There was no shaking, no struggle from the lizard itself, just the deepening darkness and the firm hold as they sank down deeper. But the animal was, in fact, very surprised at the strength of the man. Humans were small and weak by the looks of it, but this one was moving so rapidly and with such strength that he very nearly got the gator's jaws open. Instead of spinning Kevin again and risk losing its grip a second time, it simply sank to the bottom of the canal, keeping all of its attention on holding its prey locked in its mouth. By the time that they reached the sand beneath the water, most animals would have started to weaken, but Kevin was still fighting like a beast himself. It took another 2 minutes before the man showed any signs of slowing down. But after that point, Kevin's lungs could handle no more, and his brain was starting to shut down. By the 3rd minute, Kevin was still and limp, and his body had finally flooded with brackish fluid. On the shore, Laura had run into the house and called the police, and Richard raced as fast as his old legs could carry him to the dock. He screamed uselessly at the rippling surface, but no movement broke the gentle current of the canal. Laura joined her husband on the dock, and that's where police found them 12 minutes later. They used 2 of the rowing boats docked there, as well as 2 of their own motorized boats. A mix of 10 deputies and the officers of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission raced into the river, spreading out from the docking point. They were only out there for 15 minutes when they saw the alligator appear. Its snout exited the water, with Kevin still in its jaws. It was probably looking for a place to stow its victim, and it didn't expect the sudden onslaught of raging motors and people that descended upon it. Panicking at the sudden rage of noise and gunshots, it let go of Kevin and dived back down, but not before one of the trappers got a shot into it. The dart that was expelled from the rifle was attached to a rope that they were able to follow while their companions fished Kevin's lifeless body out. Just as the sun went down completely and under the light of their beams, an officer fired 2 shots, killing the murderous beast where it hid in a patch of reeds. But Kevin's end wasn't as clean as his attackers had been. His arm was hanging by tatters. It was quite remarkable that he didn't bleed to death before drowning took him. Then the furious twisting and turning during his fight nearly severed him by the waist, too. There was no use searching for the organs that had escaped his abdominal cavity now that the night had set in. The best the team could do was take what they could to the ambulance waiting on scene. Not that the paramedics could do anything for Kevin anymore. They were now just there to transport the remains. The team hooked the Alligator to their boats and sailed to land so that they could dispose of it properly. Kevin would need to be buried in a closed casket, and the monster that took his life was gone for good. Laura and Richard Bernard had warning signs set up all along the canal before the Wildlife Commission could even get to them, and they set up a memorial for Kevin too. Most of the residents of Apollo made a stop at the White Cross next to the dock to lay down flowers, and someone even planted a tree there for him. Mr. Hudgens, his last client, took some of the whitewashed fences that Kevin built for the old man, and with his old, stiff bones, he dug the holes and staked them into the ground around the cross and the tree. It was a beautiful memorial for Kevin Murray, who tragically, by the jaws of a man-eating alligator, met his final affliction. At one point, the alligator skin trade had the gators in Florida down to a meager 100. Trappers and traders made a killing, so to speak, off the booming trade. When their numbers became critically low and heavy fines and laws were placed around hunting them, the trade almost stopped completely. Yes, the gators were saved, but the efforts were more successful than anyone could have predicted. Today, Florida has well over 1 million alligators in its waters, and with that huge jump in numbers comes a huge jump in the number of attacks recorded around the Everglades, too. The area around Lakeland Canal in Florida is huge, with plenty of hidey holes for criminals to do their deals in private, and even more places for teenagers to go to do some underage drinking without being discovered. Florida is a wild place, both for the animals and the crowd of people looking for a good time. The 17th of May, 2008, was a Saturday, and a group of teenagers and college students had congregated in one of those secluded places we just mentioned. It started off innocently enough, a group of around 20 kids hanging around a small pond in the afternoon with illegally bought booze. They had inflated tubes, and the party was still going strong by the time the sun started to go down. The pretty girls and plenty of free drinks brought in dozens of other kids. By the time the evening had settled in completely, the group had swelled to more than 50. The cars supplied plenty of light, and someone even had a pretty good sound system in his car, playing the hits of the day. Just a little after 9 p.m., the party was in full swing. If you asked any of the youngsters there that day how many of the partygoers they were actually acquainted with, they would tell you that they didn't know half of the people there, and a lot of them weren't in much of a state to tell who anyone was anymore anyway. There was one young man in the crowd that no one really took notice of. He was around 21, and he'd hopped in a car with a group of young men he just met at a bar a few hours ago with the promise of a party and some pretty girls. One moment they were chatting over the counter, and the next he was at a pond where he didn't know anyone. The 3 college students that had given him a ride hadn't even bothered to catch his name. But that was all right. He didn't know their names either. The unnamed young man didn't stand out since many of the kids weren't acquainted with each other before that day, and he talked comfortably with almost everyone at some point or another during the evening. He moved between the groups of friends clustered together, making small talk for a few minutes before moving on to the next group. Like all young people seemed to do so comfortably, the conversation flowed easily between strangers, and even if they didn't know someone before that day, you made friends fast enough over football teams and pop culture. Somewhere, the young always seem to find common ground when they're thrown together. Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl just ended, and it switched over to Leona Lewis's Bleeding Love, when the laughter and music were interrupted by the telltale wail of a police siren. In a matter of seconds, before the patrol car headlights even fell on the scene, the music winked into silence. Bodies practically trampled over each other, and hordes of kids piled themselves into the nearest vehicle they could reach. The cars dispersed like a huddle of raccoons caught in the trash can. They just scattered into the night. The cops were lucky enough to pull over 2 cars, one of which had 8 people crammed into it. 12 of the more than 50 partygoers slept in jail cells that night until their parents could come and bail them out the next morning. But that unnamed man was not lucky enough to make it into one of the cars. When the sirens went off and the party dispersed, he was on the farthest side of the clearing. He'd just come back after relieving himself behind some bushes nearby, and it was quicker and safer to just jump behind the nearest tree than it was to run all the way across the clearing. He was never going to make it all the way to the nearest car before the cops arrived, so he decided to hide instead. But with only the dim light of the fire, he misjudged his step completely and crashed into the pond. With all of the stomping feet, the sirens, and the general chaos of the moment, no one took notice of the startled yelp he let out or the sound of the splash as he hit the water. It wasn't deep, just cold and muddy. He came up almost as soon as he went under, but he didn't move from the cold pond. Instead, he lay deathly still, hidden from sight by reeds and bushes. 2 police officers jumped out of the patrol car and rounded up the kids in the 2 cars that were too slow to make it out. Another patrol car raced off, hoping to catch some of the other teenagers that were fast enough to hit the dirt road. If it had still been light out, the officers would have easily spotted the young man, soaked to the bone, hiding in the shallow water. But the darkness kept him well hidden as long as he lay very, very quietly. Unbeknownst to him, there was another danger just behind him, and this one did not come with handcuffs and a gun. This one had scales and teeth. A 7-foot alligator had been stalking the pond almost all afternoon. Initially, she had her sights set on waiting for one of the partygoers to venture into the water alone, but they kept coming in to cool off in groups of 3 and 4. She had her teeth and immense strength, but she wasn't much bigger than the humans. She knew full well that she wouldn't get away with a kill if she had to fight off several of them at once. When the night came, the humans stopped going into the water, and she was just about to leave, giving up her chances of catching anything that day. But in that moment, the police arrived, and the young man fell into the water. She observed that he wasn't moving, so she inched a little closer. But there was so much movement on the banks that she was very careful to make her approach. By the time the teenagers were rounded up and the officers had them lined up and waiting for backup to arrive, she was only 4 feet away from him. She could smell the mammalian heat radiating from his body, and she had to fight all of her instincts to not jump on him right then and there. After waiting so long, she needed to approach this hunt just right if she wanted to eat at all that day. Quietly, the lad lay and watched as 2 more cars pulled up and marched the miserable teenagers into the back seats, cramming them in like sardines in a can. And even more quietly behind him, the stalker closed in even more. The gator was only 2 feet away from him now. The cars backed out, and before their headlights had even disappeared completely, the man pushed himself up from his stomach, gearing to get out of the pond. That's when the animal struck. When she saw that the boy was about to get up and out of her hunting ground, she sank her teeth into his leg, pulling him in the moment she had him in her grasp. It came out of nowhere. With his eyes on the receding patrol cars and his knees under him already, the man had no warning, no inkling of what was coming. He just felt the sharp pain suddenly shooting through his leg and the enormous heave that threw his face down into the 3-inch water. He kicked out his free leg, screaming bloody murder into the night, and felt his foot connect with something hard. That's when the reality of the situation hit him. This was an alligator, and it was pulling him away from the bank. If the drunk teenagers in the back of the patrol cars weren't bickering and yelling at each other, someone might have heard him scream. The man kicked and wiggled his body desperately, but it was no use. The creature had him away from the bank and in the open water in a matter of seconds. In that moment of panic, all traces of inebriation left him. He kicked, screamed, and swallowed pond muck, fighting the brute strength of the animal that had him in its grasp. The teeth tore through his jeans and ripped through the muscle and skin beneath the fabric. But the man no longer had any ground beneath him, just empty water. This is where the predator was most comfortable, in the deep. Instinctually, she whipped her tail and body around him, spinning as she went. She was so fast that she created a whirlpool as they descended into the dark. The young man was wound so tight that his collarbones smashed into each other. Now completely entwined and fully submerged, there was no longer any way to fight the beast. His arms were pinned to his sides, and his free leg kicked feebly as the world around him spun at dizzying speeds. Even if she didn't have him by the leg, the death roll itself was enough to incapacitate him completely. It didn't take long for the young man to sink into unconsciousness. Lack of air was only part of it. The animal's body, coiled around him, was so tight that it cut off circulation. There was no oxygen coming in from his lungs or his blood. His brain was deprived of oxygen in mere seconds. He was as good as dead the moment she had him in the open water. When he went still, the alligator unwound her reptilian hold on him. Without letting go of his leg, she swam him off into the connecting stream that fed into the pond. The place she decided to stow him so that she could feed in peace. Before the morning came, no less than 4 other alligators were attracted by the smell of blood, and it didn't take them long to find them. For hours, she fought the scavengers away from her kill, and not all that successfully. The first loss was the man's shredded leg, grabbed up by a smaller gator when her attention was on another. She fought off the one that had her occupied, but it was too late to stop the thief from getting away with the leg. She did manage to get the whole leg that was still attached herself, but only just in time before 2 more gators showed up. These ones were much larger than she was, and they shoved her out of the way to grab what limbs they could reach. In a grotesque tug-of-war, each gator had an arm in its mouth. It didn't take them long to each get away with a piece. Luckily, they were happy with the arms they got, and they disappeared into the early morning light with their stolen breakfast. And there, on that riverbank, is where 2 fishermen found the gator later that morning, still fighting away a small congregation of younger alligators that collected around her. The authorities were there within minutes of receiving the call, but it wasn't going to be a simple extraction. The female was maddened by anger. Her kill had been repeatedly snatched up piece by piece, and by now she'd been fighting for almost 12 hours. She was out of her mind with rage. No amount of noise could chase her away from the corpse, and she snapped and stormed at anyone and any boat that dared approach her. It took 3 shots to kill the enraged animal, and several more to disperse the collection of alligators that milled around the area. At the end of the day, 4 gators were dragged out, the female among them, but only she had any remains inside her stomach. The other 3 weren't lucky enough to get away with a scrap. This posed a huge problem for the authorities. The young man had no arms, and therefore no fingerprints that could be extracted from the remains. His head was still intact, but barely. The night's fight, with several animals involved, had left such a ruined mess behind that he was no longer recognizable by his facial features. The rest of his remains, too, were scratched, torn, and ripped. So even if he'd had any tattoos, they were now no longer identifiable. The only thing they could do was take DNA from his teeth and hair and put it in storage. And that's where those samples are to this day, gathering dust at the back of a storage facility almost 20 years later. John Doe was never identified. No one knows where he came from or who his family were. And after so many years, it's unlikely that we'll be able to put a name on the unmarked grave that stands in a graveyard in Florida. His identity will forever be a mystery, unlike the story of his terrifying final affliction.